The scorching Nebraska sun beat down on Highway 80 as Chester Dvorak wiped the sweat from his brow. It was July 1967, and the road crew supervisor had seen everything in his 20 years of maintaining this stretch of asphalt. Roadkill, abandoned cars, even a stolen safe once. But nothing like this. His shovel struck something solid beneath the gravel shoulder, and when he bent down to investigate, his blood ran cold. A human skull grinned up at him from the red dirt, bleached white by years of exposure. Chester stumbled backward, his boot catching on something else. More bones, scattered like forgotten toys along the roadside. Within an hour, Sheriff Dale Hutchins arrived from the nearby town of Gothenburg, population 3,200. He'd been sheriff for 15 years and prided himself on knowing every soul in Dawson County. But these bones belonged to a stranger. State forensics arrived by nightfall, and Dr. Miriam Skolnick delivered her preliminary findings with clinical precision. Female, approximately 60 to 70 years old, been here 3 to 5 years. Sheriff Hutchins frowned, flipping through his missing persons reports. Every unsolved disappearance in his files was male. Elderly men who'd vanished without explanation. Olden Thatcher, the wealthy widower from Kearney. Baxter Holmes, the retired railroad man from North Platte. Garrett Price, who owned half of Ogallala. All men, all old, all gone. "Doc, you sure about the gender?" Hutchins asked, though he knew better than to question Skolnick's expertise. She held up a pelvic bone, pointing to its distinctive shape. "Certain as death itself, Sheriff." As they excavated further, they found more bones, fragments that told a disturbing story. Someone had tried to dissolve these bodies, reduce them to nothing. But the Nebraska soil had preserved what the killer thought destroyed. By dawn, they'd marked 17 distinct burial sites along a 5-mile stretch of highway. 17 victims. 17 secrets buried in the American heartland. 5 years earlier, in the sterile corridors of Omaha General Hospital, Marlowe Caine crushed another pill into powder with practiced efficiency. At 32, she possessed the kind of severe beauty that made patients uncomfortable. Sharp cheekbones, eyes like frozen lakes, hands that moved with surgical precision. She'd been a nurse for 8 years, and she was very good at her job. Perhaps too good. Her partner in the pharmacy, Estelle Riddle, was her opposite in every way. Round-faced and warm, with a smile that could disarm anyone, Estelle had the gift of making people trust her instantly. At 28, she'd already buried 2 husbands, both substantially older, both conveniently wealthy, both dead from heart complications. No one had questioned it. The women had met 3 years prior when Estelle joined the hospital staff. They recognized something in each other that first day, a shared emptiness where conscience should live. They began small, stealing medication, forging prescriptions, selling barbiturates to desperate housewives. But it wasn't enough. "We're wasting our talents," Marlowe said one November evening in 1962, her apartment thick with cigarette smoke. "We know how bodies work, how they fail, how to make death look natural. We know how to forge documents. Why are we living in this shithole when there are lonely old men out there with money and no family?" Estelle smiled that dangerous smile. "You're talking about murder." Marlowe lit another cigarette. "I'm talking about redistribution of wealth. They're dying anyway. We just accelerate the inevitable and ensure their assets go to someone who appreciates them." They were fired 2 weeks later when an inventory discrepancy revealed thousands of dollars in missing pharmaceuticals. The hospital chose quiet termination over scandal. It was the push they needed. Marlowe sold her apartment and bought a used Chevrolet Bel Air. Estelle acquired fake nursing credentials, business cards, reference letters, all perfectly forged. They studied obituaries, census records, property deeds. They mapped small towns across Nebraska where elderly widowers lived alone, where neighbors minded their own business, where a kind face and a professional demeanor could open any door. Kearney, Nebraska, population 14,000, seemed frozen in time when Marlowe's Chevrolet rolled down Central Avenue in March 1963. She'd chosen Olden Thatcher carefully. The 72-year-old owned a 400-acre farm worth $60,000, had no living relatives, and hadn't seen a doctor in 5 years. His wife had died in 1959, and according to the local gossip Estelle had gathered at the diner, he was lonely enough to talk to fence posts. Marlowe knocked on his farmhouse door on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing her most conservative dress and carrying a carefully aged photograph. "Mr. Thatcher? I'm Marlowe Caine. I believe we're related through your late wife's side. The Haversham family from Iowa?" She watched his weathered face transform with desperate hope. Loneliness was a weapon, and she wielded it expertly. Within a week, she'd moved into his spare room as his long-lost niece, cooking his meals and listening to his stories. Estelle visited twice weekly as Nurse Riddle, checking his blood pressure and administering vitamin injections that were actually mild sedatives. They worked him like a long con. Marlowe drove him to a lawyer in Grand Island, far enough that no local would recognize them, where Olden signed a new will, leaving everything to his beloved niece. The document was legal, properly witnessed, unassailable. The killing began in May. Marlowe increased the barbiturate dosages gradually, mixing pentobarbital into his evening coffee. His speech slurred. His hands trembled. When he asked about seeing a doctor, she soothed him with promises and more pills. On June 3, 1963, Olden Thatcher died in his sleep. The local doctor, seeing an elderly man with a history of heart problems, signed the death certificate without hesitation. Cardiac arrest. Natural causes. The funeral was small. Marlowe wept convincingly. Within 6 weeks, she'd sold the farm, liquidated his assets, and deposited $58,000 across various banks. But they had a problem. Olden's body was buried in Kearney Cemetery, a permanent record. They learned from their mistake. In North Platte that November, Baxter Holmes never made it to a grave. The 70-year-old retired railroad supervisor lived in a modest house downtown, his pension checks piling up in a savings account he never touched. Estelle befriended him at the Veterans Hall, playing the concerned nurse worried about his declining health. This time, they refined the method. Higher doses, faster timeline, and most crucially, cremation. When Baxter died after 6 weeks of nursing care, his will named Estelle as beneficiary. She told the funeral home he'd wanted cremation, citing his fear of being buried alive that she'd invented. His ashes went into the Missouri River. No body, no questions. $43,000 richer, they moved to Ogallala in spring 1964. Garrett Price owned a hardware store and 3 rental properties. At 68, he was younger than their previous targets, sharper. Marlowe had to work harder, visiting his store daily, helping with inventory, becoming indispensable. She poisoned him slowly over 4 months, watching his robust health deteriorate into confusion and weakness. His sister from Colorado grew suspicious, but by the time she arrived to investigate, Garrett was dead, and Marlowe was gone with $72,000. They didn't cremate Garrett. Instead, Marlowe drove his body 60 miles east in the trunk of her Chevrolet. In a remote corner of farmland she'd scouted, she poured industrial lye over the corpse in a steel drum, watching flesh dissolve into soup. What remained, bones, teeth, gristle, she buried along Highway 80, mixing the fragments with roadside gravel. It was efficient, perfect. By December 1965, they'd killed Winslow McDermott in Sydney, an 81-year-old with dairy farm wealth. His bones joined the others along the highway, white fragments scattered like seeds. 4 victims, $210,000 accumulated. They'd become efficient predators, moving through Nebraska's small towns like wolves through sheep pastures. Detective Quincy Armstead of the Nebraska State Patrol had the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw coincidence. At 46, he'd worked fraud, embezzlement, and organized crime for 2 decades. In January 1966, a routine audit of estate transfers caught his attention. 4 elderly men in 4 different counties, all dying within 3 years, all leaving substantial assets to previously unknown female relatives or caregivers. The women had different names on each document, but the handwriting on the wills showed similarities. Armstead spread the files across his desk in Lincoln. Olden Thatcher, niece, appeared from nowhere. Baxter Holmes, nurse, befriended him at Veterans Hall. Garrett Price, store assistant, wormed her way into his life. Winslow McDermott, distant cousin, materialized 6 months before his death. All men were widowers, isolated, wealthy. All died of natural causes, with conveniently timed wills. He drove to Kearney first, interviewing neighbors who remembered Marlowe, though descriptions varied. Tall, dark-haired, cold eyes, said one. Medium height, pleasant enough, said another. Memory was unreliable, but the pattern held. In North Platte, the funeral director remembered Estelle Riddle. Insisted on cremation, paid cash, never saw her again. The name Riddle appeared nowhere else in the records, but when Armstead checked with the Nebraska Board of Nursing, no Estelle Riddle held a valid license. In Ogallala, Garrett's sister, Dolores Price, still lived in Colorado. I told the sheriff something was wrong, she said over the phone, her voice bitter. That woman isolated him, got him to change his will. By the time I drove out, he could barely speak. The doctor said stroke, but I never believed it. Armstead requested the death certificates, all signed by different small-town physicians, all listing cardiovascular failure. He needed something concrete. Bodies would help, but 3 were cremated or missing. Only Olden remained buried. Exhumation required court orders, evidence, probable cause. The break came from an unexpected source. Armstead spent weeks cross-referencing pharmacy records across western Nebraska, looking for unusual medication purchases. In March 1966, a pharmacist in Lexington named Roger Pembroke called the State Patrol office. I got your bulletin about barbiturate sales. We had a woman come through last year, bought a suspicious amount of pentobarbital with a prescription from a Dr. Harrison Webb. I filled it, but something felt off, so I kept a copy. Armstead drove to Lexington immediately. The prescription was professional, properly formatted, but when he contacted the Nebraska Medical Board, Dr. Harrison Webb didn't exist. The signature was forged. Can you describe her? Armstead asked. Pembroke shrugged. Brown hair, maybe 35, nice enough. Paid cash. Said she was caring for her uncle with terminal cancer. One forged prescription meant nothing, but Armstead found 3 more. Different pharmacies, different fake doctors, same handwriting. Someone with medical knowledge was stockpiling barbiturates across the state. He created a timeline. The prescription dates aligned with the victims' deaths, purchased weeks before each man died. In May, Armstead caught a genuine break. A bank teller in Grand Island remembered processing a large estate check for a woman named Marlowe Caine in 1963. She was memorable because she insisted on cashier's checks, split across 4 different banks. Said it was for tax purposes, but it seemed odd. The teller had kept a transaction record with a forwarding address, a post office box in Scottsbluff that no longer existed. But it was a name, a real name, connected to Olden Thatcher's estate. Armstead requested fingerprints from Olden's farmhouse. The state lab lifted dozens of prints from doorknobs, glasses, furniture. He ran them through the FBI database, a process that took weeks in 1966. In June, he got a hit. Marlowe Caine, fingerprints on file from a 1962 hospital employment termination in Omaha. The same fingerprints appeared in Garrett Price's hardware store. Cornelius Waverly made their first critical mistake possible. The 76-year-old lived in Lexington in a Victorian house his grandfather built, sitting on land worth $80,000. He was their seventh target, and Marlowe had grown confident, perhaps too confident. She'd introduced herself in April 1966 as his second cousin from Kansas, producing an elaborate family tree she'd forged. Cornelius, sharp despite his age, seemed uncertain, but loneliness won out, as it always did. What Marlowe didn't know was that Cornelius had a friend, Ruth Gunderson, a widow who lived 3 houses down. They played chess every Thursday, a ritual for 15 years. When Marlowe moved in and Cornelius started canceling their games, Ruth grew concerned. "Something's not right," she told her son, a deputy in the county sheriff's office. "Cornelius is forgetting things, sleeping through the day. That cousin of his won't let me visit." Ruth began documenting everything: dates, times, suspicious activities. On June 12th, Cornelius handed her an envelope during a rare moment when Marlowe was shopping. "If anything happens to me," he whispered, his words slurred from barbiturates, "give this to the police." He died 4 days later. Estelle had rushed the final dose, impatient to move on to their next target in alliance. They cleaned the house quickly, taking his cash, jewelry, and important documents. But in their haste, they left behind a bottle of pentobarbital under the bathroom sink, a syringe in the trash, and Marlowe's fingerprints on a coffee cup they'd forgotten to wash. Ruth delivered the envelope to her son the day after the funeral. Inside was a letter describing his cousin's strange behavior, her insistence on controlling his medication, her urgency in changing his will. The deputy contacted Detective Armstead immediately. When state police processed Cornelius's house, they found everything. The barbiturates matched the forged prescriptions. The fingerprints matched Marlowe Caine from Omaha. By August 1966, Armstead had enough for an arrest warrant. The FBI joined the investigation, designating it a multi-state murder conspiracy. Agents tracked bank records, hotel registrations, and vehicle purchases. Marlowe's Chevrolet Bel Air was registered in South Dakota under a false name, but the VIN number led them to the original Omaha sale. They discovered Estelle Riddle's real identity, Estelle Kowalski, wanted for fraud in Iowa, suspected in the deaths of her 2 previous husbands, though never charged. The women had last been seen in Alliance, Nebraska, in July, posing as visiting nurses. By the time police arrived, they'd vanished. Armstead studied their pattern. They moved west along Highway 80, staying in small motor courts, paying cash, never remaining more than 3 months. He contacted law enforcement across Wyoming, asking them to watch for 2 women matching their descriptions. On September 3, 1966, a motel clerk in Rock Springs, Wyoming, recognized Marlowe from a wanted poster. She'd checked in alone the previous night, paying for a week in advance. FBI agents surrounded the Stardust Motor Court at dawn. When they breached Room 14, they found both women and evidence of their next target: surveillance photos of an elderly rancher in Green River, forged nursing credentials, and a suitcase containing $47,000 in cash and bonds. Marlowe reached for a pistol in her purse. An agent fired a warning shot, and she surrendered. Estelle collapsed immediately, sobbing, begging for mercy. In the Chevrolet's trunk, they found the murder kit: bottles of barbiturates, syringes, lye, shovels, and, most damning, a road map of Nebraska, with 12 locations marked in red ink along Highway 80. Each mark corresponded to a burial site. In Marlowe's notebook, they found names, dates, amounts stolen. A ledger of death. She documented everything with accountant precision. Her fatal arrogance. Extradited to Nebraska, the women were held in separate cells in Lincoln. Estelle broke within 24 hours. Estelle's confession came in a flood of tears and self-preservation. She gave prosecutors everything in exchange for life imprisonment instead of execution. Over 3 days in September 1966, she detailed 12 murders spanning 4 years. She drew maps showing burial locations, explained the lie dissolution process, identified victims by name and town. Most crucially, she testified that Marlowe Caine was the architect, the planner, the one who selected victims and orchestrated each killing. Estelle claimed she was manipulated, controlled, afraid to refuse. It was partially true and entirely calculated. State police began excavations along Highway 80 in October. Using Estelle's maps and ground-penetrating radar, they uncovered bone fragments at all 12 marked sites. Forensic analysis was primitive by later standards, but Dr. Skolnick and her team worked meticulously. They identified victims through dental records, healed fractures, and distinctive skeletal features. The bones told their stories, evidence of prolonged poisoning in some, stress markers indicating suffering in others. At Marlowe's apartment in Omaha, which she'd maintained under a false name, they found the tools of her trade: forged medical licenses, blank prescription pads, notary stamps, wills in various stages of preparation. She'd kept souvenirs, too: a watch from Baxter Holmes, cufflinks from Garrett Price, photographs of her victims that she'd taken while they were dying. In a locked desk drawer, prosecutors found her journals. Marlowe had documented everything with clinical detachment, describing her victims' deterioration, noting which drugs worked fastest, calculating profit margins. She'd written about Olden Thatcher. Subject showed expected resistance to initial dosage, increased concentration by 40%. Result? Compliance and docility achieved within 72 hours. A state transfer completed without complications. Total yield, $58,000. Expenses, $340. Net profit, $57,660. It wasn't a confession. It was a business record. Her lawyers argued the journals were fiction, creative writing. The trial began in Lincoln on February 6, 1968, in a courthouse packed with journalists, victims' distant relatives, and curious citizens. Nebraska hadn't executed a woman since 1887, and the prospect drew national attention. Prosecutor James Whitfield presented overwhelming evidence: the journals, the bones, the forged documents, the marked map, and Estelle's devastating testimony. Marlowe's defense attorney, Harold Finch, attempted to discredit Estelle as an unreliable accomplice seeking leniency, but the physical evidence was irrefutable. Marlowe herself never testified, sitting motionless throughout the 6-week trial, her face a mask of contempt. When victim impact statements were read, letters from Dolores Price, from Ruth Gunderson, from community members who'd known the dead men, she showed nothing. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on 12 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Morton Kellerman showed no mercy during sentencing. You perverted the trust society places in medical professionals. You exploited the fundamental human need for companionship. You killed methodically, repeatedly, without remorse. This court sentences you to death by electrocution. Marlowe smiled for the first time. Estelle received life imprisonment without parole, as promised. She would die in prison in 1983, never expressing genuine remorse. Marlowe's appeals exhausted themselves over 18 months. On August 14, 1969, at Nebraska State Penitentiary, Marlowe Caine was led to the electric chair. She refused final words, refused clergy, refused everything except a cigarette. At 12:07 a.m., The current surged through her body. She was pronounced dead at 12:11. In the years following, Highway 80 became known locally as the Death Road. Small memorials appeared at the burial sites, crosses, flowers, reminders that 12 men who'd sought only companionship in their final years had instead found monsters. Detective Armstead retired in 1974, haunted by one question: how many others had there been before they started marking their map?